Welcome to Chapter 6.
In early September 683 CE, a Mayan man by the name of Chan Balun took an obsidian knife and inserted 3 deep cuts into the skin of his penis. By 8000 to 7000 BCE, the peoples of Mesoamerica began to experiment with the cultivation of multiple vegetables and fruits such as chili peppers, avocados, squashes, and many more. They later added tomatoes to their cultivation.
During the 1,000 years following the Olmec's disappearance of about 100 BCE, many complex societies arose in many Mesoamerican regions. Some of them evolved into genuine cities. They attracted large populations of residents that would stay there permanently. They also embarked on ambitious programs of construction. They also maintained large markets and encouraged increase in specialization of labor. The Mayans created a remarkable society that is now occupied by southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. The Mayan priests constructed the most elaborate calendar of the ancient Americas. The calendar that the priests constructed interwove 2 kinds of year. The first year was the solar year, which consisted of 365 days. This year governed the agriculture. The second year was the ritual year, which consisted of 260 days. One of the cities that the Mayans built was Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was one of the most thriving Mayan cities that they built. It was an agricultural village built by 500 BCE. Around 200 BCE, Tenochtitlan was thriving very well, and by the end of the millennium, its population reached a peak of 50,000. Around 500 CE, the city began to experience increased military pressure from its neighboring villages. In the middle of the 8th century, invaders sacked and burned the city of Tenochtitlan. Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you. This has been Chapter 6. Peace.
Welcome to Chapter 25! Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our program tonight. From the start of the 16th century to the mid-18th century, the Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Dutch exploited the Americas and the Caribbean and slaughtered their people. When European peoples first sought to establish their presence in the Americas, they brought a wide range of new technology never before seen in the area. The first set of interaction between Europe and the American peoples was the Caribbean. Christopher Columbus and his immediate followers made the island of Hispaniola the Spanish base of operations in the Caribbean after taking it from the Taínos. The Spanish settlers first attempted to provide for their society in the Caribbean by mining gold, but they had way too little people. Therefore,
Found the gold! Woo! Hey, look, I found it!
the Spanish ended up using the Taino people in a system which they called the encomienda. Encomienda was brutal and it started the decline of the Taino people, but it was nowhere near as devastating as the epidemic disease. Smallpox brought the population from 4 million in 1492 to only a few thousand in the 1540s. There ended up being very little gold in the Caribbean, and so the French, Dutch, and English started producing cash crops.
I'll do it! I'll do it!
Yeah, are we live? The Spanish soon set their sights on the Americas, particularly Mexico and Peru. Francisco Pizarro experienced similar results when he led a Spanish expedition in Peru and topped the Inca Empire with a small force of 600 people. Spanish administrators established the 2 main centers of authority in the Americas, Mexico and Peru. The Spanish had viceroys, which were representatives from Spain of the king, and they had immense power. The conquest of South America and the Caribbean was dominated by the Spanish. However, the first North American permanent colony was created by the British, In the early 1700s, Jamestown, Virginia was colonized by John Smith and his group of colonizers. They faced very harsh conditions after creating a village near a river. They faced harsh winters, starvation, and damage from the Powhatan tribe. During the first few years, a majority of people died until more came on boats. The starvation was so bad sometimes that they resorted to cannibalism.
There.
The conquest of South America and the Caribbean was primarily dominated by the Spanish. However, the first permanent North American colony was in Jamestown, Virginia, by the British. In the early 1700s, John Smith and his group of colonizers came on boats to Jamestown, Virginia, where they built a village near a river. They faced very harsh conditions, like the cold, starvation, and the Powhatan Indian tribes. The starvation got so bad at some points that cannibalism occurred. During the first few years, a majority of people living in Jamestown died, but more and more people came. This led to more and more colonies coming, which led to the 13 colonies, which led to the Revolutionary War, and now America is here today. The conquest of the Americas by European settlers is a double-edged sword. On one hand, millions of indigenous people were killed by disease and the willpower of men like Francisco Pizarro and Hernan Cortez. On the other hand, the conquest of the Americas has led to the most advanced civilizations yet, and world superpowers who donate money to people in need and help out the world. We thank you for joining this broadcast tonight, and good night to all Chapter 25 viewers.
Welcome to Chapter 31. Westward expansion caused conflict between indigenous peoples, the settlers, and the government because of the indigenous peoples not wanting to be pushed out of their ancestral lands and their hunting grounds. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 showed that the U.S. was determined to move out the Native Americans into Indian Territory, which was Oklahoma at the time. Anti-slavery forces grew with the slave population. An example of this could be the Missouri Compromise, which was a bunch of compromises that helped show how serious the U.S. was about moving the indigenous people out of their way so they can gain their land. The election of Lincoln helped ignite the Civil War, and 11 of the southern states withdrew from the United Nations as it was their right to do so. Slavery and cotton had isolated the southern states from economic developments. Southerners considered themselves self-sufficient, while Northerners saw it as illegal insurrection and an act of betrayal. They fought against slavery and the concept of a state subjected to blackmail. War changed character, though, when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which made getting rid of slavery their main goal. The victory of the northern states ended slavery and also helped the states stay politically united. Independence came gradually as the British government and the Canadians agreed on general principles of autonomy. By the late 19th century, Canada was in control of its own destiny despite ties to Britain and the presence of the U.S. International migration within America also contributed to a new economic landscape. Gold discoveries drew in prospectors trying to gain a fortune, and after the mid-19th century, European migrants flocked to North America where they filled up the factories. By keeping labor costs down, migrants helped to increase the profitability and fuel the U.S.'s expansion. Caused tension between the U.S. and Mexico, whose territories were Texas, California, and New Mexico. Texas declared independence from Mexico in 1836 and got accepted as a new state by the U.S. against Mexico's protest. This led to conflicts that rapidly changed into the Mexico-American War, which lasted from 1846 to 1848. The U.S. instigated the war and then defeated the Mexican army. During the mid-19th century, the U.S. crushed native resistance to westward expansion in North America. Argentine and Chilean forces brought modern weapons to bear in their campaign to conquer the indigenous of South America. After the defeat of the war, though, a liberal reform movement attempted to reshape Mexican society. La Reforma wanted to limit the power of the military and the Roman Catholic Church in Mexican society. This challenged some of the fundamental conservatism of Mexican elites. By the early 20th century, Mexico was a divided land going towards civil war. The Mexican Revolution broke out when middle-class Mexicans joined with peasants and workers to overthrow the dictator Porfirio Diaz. This was to attempt to topple the unequal system of land estate in which 95% of peasants were landless. Lower classes took weapons and followed the revolutionary leaders Emiliano Zapata and Francisco Villa. Despite their power and popularity, Zapata and Villa were unable to capture Mexico's major cities. The revolution came to an end when Villa and Zapata were both killed. The War of 1812, the U.S. declared war on Britain in retaliation for encroachments on the U.S. rights during the Napoleonic Wars. Despite their resources, Canada jumped in, won the war, and their victories brought a sense of Canadian pride.
Mass migration and British investment helped shape the economic development throughout the Americas. European and Italian peoples migrated to the U.S., Canada, and Latin America in mass amounts. The gold rush of 1849 also brought in a lot of migrants, but mostly Europeans came to work on factories, railroads, and construction sites and plantations of the Americas. People also came because their religious beliefs, foods, and traditions were migrating with them, which made them more comfortable. After the mid-19th century, European migrants came more to North America to work on factories, which was great for industrialists looking for low-skilled workers who'd work for low wages. These low wages helped increase profits and expand the U.S. industry. Chinese migrants came to North America to help cultivate crops or build the Central Pacific Railroad or search for gold in Canada. Migrants who moved to Latin America mostly worked on agricultural situations. For example, Italian migrants were paid by Brazilian government to work as coffee growers since they were having a labor shortage due to the abolition of slavery. Other migrants came from Asian lands. For example, Chinese migrants came to work on sugarcane in Cuba, and Indian migrants came to work in other parts of South America. Their investments were made due to Britain's own industrialization, which generated enormous wealth and a need for profitable outlets for their funds. This eventually led to the U.S. outperforming Britain's own economy because of all their success. Another important economic development of the 19th century was the construction of railroads. The boom of railroad construction created a dense sense of transportation, communication, and distribution of networks. This new development provided cheap transportation for agricultural commodities, manufactured goods, and individual travelers. Railroads even changed the American sense of time. Because of complications, 4 time zones were created. They were designing and transporting new products to markets through railroads. For example, they had electric lights, telephones, typewriters, motion picture cameras, and many more transported. There was some conflict regarding railroad situations, however, big businesses came on top and ultimately became one of the world's major industrial powers. British investment for Canadian agricultural products and minerals gave white Canadian Americans a higher standard of living before industrialization. Their national policy sparked agricultural, mining, and industrial production in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The U.S. had a smaller role in investments compared to Britain, but ultimately owned 30% of all Canadian industries. On the other hand, Latin America was unable to go through any industrialization or economic development due to the competitiveness with European products and their cheap goods. Latin American elites controlled most of local economies and therefore profited greatly from European trade and investment, which is why they made no attempt to seek economic change. British investors were less interested in having Latin America as a trading partner because they didn't think they had enough to offer. However, most control over industries remained in foreign hands and decisions were made in the interest of elites. As the Europeans moved west, the indigenous lands were taken over and the U.S. began to work on reducing native autonomy and assimilating them to the white way of life. Government officials would remove native children from their families and put them in white boarding schools, banning their tribal language and attire. After the Civil War, slavery ended and northern troops were sent to the southern states to start the Reconstruction. However, once the troops left, a lot of violence and intimidation started to occur, breaking the reforms of the Reconstruction. Chinese migrants that came to Canada during that time were mostly segregated and separated from any political affairs. The French Canadians often consorted or married Native women, giving rise to the Métis population. A man named Louis Riel rise as a political leader for Métis population in Western Canada. Due to the Métis' concern of having their local land rights threatened, Riel was asked to lead a resistance of railroad and British Canadian settlement. He organized the Northwest Rebellion but was ultimately defeated and executed for treason. Moving back to the topic of Latin America, large-scale migration brought diversity in the 19th century. While Chinese migrants didn't have much of an impact in Latin society, Europeans and Indians had their own foreign influence. Male domination was more of a significant characteristic in Latin America than it was in the US or Canada in the 19th century. Women had no part in voting, any political manners, or estate ownership, and were subject to violence and beating. After the mid-19th century, educational opportunities became more prevalent for girls, even though there wasn't a strong women's movement.
What we do here is go back.
Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Toyama's AP World History. This is Chapter 17, The Foundations of Christian Society in Western Europe.
After the fall of the Roman Empire in 476, you had a lot of Germanic invasions happening to claim over the territory. In Spain, you had Visigoths. In Italy, you had Ostrogoths. In Britain, you had Angles and Saxons, and many more. One of the most influential kingdoms to arise from the Germanic invasions were the Franks. The Franks had a heavy influence in the European development because of their strong agricultural base. This meant that all economic centers of gravity would shift from southern lands like Italy into more northern lands like Germany and France. Along with their firm alliance with the Western Christian Church, they became a very powerful empire. One of the most important Frankish leaders was Clovis. He dominated other Germanic people and launched campaigns to expand the empire. But what was most notorious for him was his transition from paganism to Christianity in the Frankish Empire. Before Clovis, the Franks were very paganistic, but with the arrival of him and the influence of his wife, they became mostly Christian. This meant for them an alliance with the Western Church. After Clovis's death, his successors weren't able to maintain the Frankish Empire for any longer, so they were displaced by the Carolingians. The founder of the Carolingian dynasty is Charles the Hammer Martel. By defeating them, he halted Muslim and Middle Eastern advancements into Western Europe. The important emperor in the Carolingian dynasty was Charlemagne, which was the grandson of Charles Martel. He made the Carolingians a centralized imperial rule, and he was kind of illiterate, but he was actually very smart. He spoke Greek, Latin, and had very extensive conversations with theologians. This also led into his diplomatic life because he had relationships with the Byzantine Empire. Also, he had major military achievements, and this led to the expansion of the empire. Charlemagne's administration, he established a capital in Germany. But because of his constant travels, he had imperial officials check up on his towns to make sure everything was going all right. So Charlemagne really didn't want to call himself an emperor for diplomatic reasons with the Byzantine. He didn't want to challenge them in any way over their land, but he acted as one. So in December, while he was attending a religious service, Pope Leon III told him, "Hey dude, I'm gonna crown you right now, on the spot." And he accepted. This was him finally being recognized for all the public things that he does. So you had Louis, which was the son of Charlemagne, but he didn't have as much control over the empire as his father once did. So he lost control of it, and there was civil war erupting between three of the sons. The empire was divided in 843. Despite of internal affairs, the empire was most likely to fall because of external problems, such as invasions. You had invasions coming in from the south, the Muslims, and you had the east, where the Vikings were coming from. With the Vikings, this led to the Norse expansion, which began in 800 CE. This was driven by population pressure of the agriculture they came from not being able to sustain their population anymore. Because of their superior seafarer technology, they were able to travel among the European rivers. So you had the Vikings, which got their name from Vik, Norway, and they had boats with shallow drafts that were capable of traveling through the river. This opened up for a lot of possibilities to attack many places. Constantinople was a victim of this, and it got raided 3 times. The Carthaginians had no defense because they had no navy, so they were dependent on local defenses. In 800 CE, England was one of the first to suffer the earliest Viking attacks. This led to the formation of Angles, Saxons, and many other small kingdoms. These small kingdoms came under the rule of King Alfred. King Alfred built a navy in order to one day challenge the Vikings. He also focused a lot in fortifying the city against attacks. During this time of invasions, Odo of Saxony defeated the Mangards in 954. So he was proclaimed emperor by Pope in 962. He established the Holy Roman Empire, and they lost local autonomy. This led to early medieval society. So the concept of feudalism, this was lords and the renters which would plow in it and cultivate it. This meant that there was more. This was the de-evolution of centralized government into more local authorities. Local authorities that detached themselves from the Carthaginian Empire became local authorities for their own small village. They still had allegiance to the Carthaginian, but it was more increasing independence. Had incentives, which were land grants and income coming in from mills. This was the formation of a hereditary noble class, so you were born into what you were born into. Renters were very important in their society because they led many local projects such as justice and social welfare. Relationship between lords and retainers, because a lord could be a retainer to somebody else, and it just got all confusing. This feudalistic system, there was high possibility of there being rebellions. It still developed, such as Germany and France, used this system. Another class being formed by Roman slaves and peasants. Between slavery and freedom, so they called this class serfs. They would cultivate the land, and in return they were allowed to stay there, but they pledged to their lord loyalty, military services, and anything they would need.
In the economy of early medieval Europe, agricultural output was insufficient to support the growth of cities. There was strong Mediterranean trade despite Muslim domination of the sea.
There were also Norse merchant mariners that linked the Islamic world for trade. Growth of Europe from 200 to 1000 CE. In 200 CE, there was 36 million people. In 400 CE, there was 31 million people. In 600 CE, there was 26 million people. In 800 CE, there was 28 million people. In 900 CE, there was 31 million people. And in 1000 CE, there was 36 million people. The church supplies Clovis with a number of literature workers, such as scribes and secretaries. The Franks spread Christianity in northern areas and support scholarship and scribal activities. Charlemagne then fights pagan Saxons from 772 to 804. This dude named Pope Gregory I, and he was here from 590 CE to 604 CE. He was also known as Gregory the Great. Asserted papal primacy and was a prominent theologian. He had major missionary activities, especially in England. Monasticism originates in Egypt from the 2nd to the 3rd century, and the lifestyle later expands to the 4th century. There was a large variety of monastic rules ranging from very ascetic to very relaxed. Sister Saint Scholastica was alive from 482 to 543 CE and adopts Benedictine rules for converts. In monasticism and society, there was an accumulation of large landholdings. There were also social welfare projects, especially labor contributions. There's an expansion of literacy, and they started to create inns, hospitals, and orphanages.